That's not very loud.
It's not loud at all.
Good morning, everyone. All right.
That's a bit better.
That's a bit better.
Welcome, everyone. It's a real pleasure for both of us to be here. Myself and Lars know each other from a long time ago. You know, I think the first day we met, we were fighting over whose iPod playlist was the best at 3 in the morning in a hotel in Atlanta. So we've come a long way.
That's a true story. We were playing iPod DJs and battling, and so it's still a bit of a rivalry between us. So
it's a bit of an embarrassment.
Yeah.
Folks, we want to talk to you about the identity crisis of work. I want to open by telling a short story of my taxi ride in here this morning. My taxi driver was telling me about his 2 kids. One is 26, one's 24. They both work in the same company. His daughter's worked there 6 years. His son started in January 2020. And their company's going back to work next week. They're going back to the office. What do you think the reaction of his daughter, who's been there 6 years, is? Happy or sad? Happy. She's delighted. Can't wait to get back and see her colleagues. What about the son who only ever spent a month in the office before the pandemic? Yeah, he's not happy. Right? This father was telling me how the son every Sunday night, he's effing and blinding, like, I want to go back to the office. How dare they make me go in there, et cetera, et cetera. Same company, right? Same family, 2 completely different views on what work looks like or needs to look like as we go back to the office. Before we get into the conversation, we wanted to try and just get your sentiment on a quick poll. So we're going to go to that Slido app. I think we're going to bring up a question here on the slides. So we want to ask you, where do you believe your organization best serves the long-term needs of your people? Right? Do you think, in terms of serving your people, is it better that you have a hybrid policy, a full-time remote policy, or an in-office policy? So if you haven't already done this, go to slido.com, put in 990389, or easier, take your camera out, scan that QR code, it'll bring you straight there, and answer that question. So in the service of your people, from your people's perspective, what do you think is the best way you can approach the return to work or your work policies going forward? Hybrid, full-time remote, in-office. So once you've answered that, I'm going to ask you to answer one more question. It's very similar, so you might miss it, but next question we want you to ask is from the perspective of your organization. So wearing the organization's hat, what do you think is the best way to serve the long-term needs of your organization? So the first question is from the perspective of your people. Second question, the perspective of your organization. Same thing, hybrid, in-office, full-time remote. So we got a couple of hundred on the first question so far. I think the answer was overwhelming.
Hybrid, yeah. And only slightly less from the employer perspective.
Yeah.
So I think it went from 94% employee perspective, 90% employer perspective, which is interesting. Yeah.
So it is, right? And most of us, when we think about hybrid working, most of us are thinking about the place we work in. And that question is designed that way because that's what we expect. Is it, where are we working and that place? I wanted to open up our conversation, Lars, on that, because that is, I think, what most people think when they talk about hybrid working. They're thinking about where are our workforce.
Yeah.
Well, you have a different perspective of that, something you've called hybrid 2.0.
Yeah.
Can you maybe share with the audience what is that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think for all of you, go back in the time machine to March of 2020, as we had the moment where everybody basically had to vacate your offices, you had to go home. We essentially ported the way that we work that happened in office to doing that digitally. But for the most part, the way that we work didn't change, right? We still had meetings, synchronous meetings to discuss and plan everything. We still kind of operated in the typical 9-to-5 setting and environment, and that carried on for many companies even to this day. And I think what's interesting now is now that many organizations have made longer-term commitments to hybrid, we know this is here to stay. We're starting to see companies be much more intentional about how they think about how and where work happens. So I think when you look at the evolution from hybrid 1.0 to hybrid 2.0, it's being much more intentional about synchronous work versus asynchronous work versus overlap of time zones and coordination, and how work gets done. And I think we have to be honest about hybrid as well. If you look at the 3 models of work, right, co-located, fully distributed, or hybrid, hybrid is by far the most difficult to get right. So this is not an easy road that we're going down. And even within hybrid, there are dozens of flavors of what hybrid even means. So I think that it's, this is the first phase of the next chapter of hybrid where we really start to design for it. The old thing we always say that, meetings should have been an email. Maybe those will become more emails. And the meeting time will really be preserved for getting work done and having the right stakeholders in place as opposed to just meetings to talk about things that don't really need to be meetings.
I love that reframing of hybrid beyond location, like where, which is I think most of us think about that. I'd love it, maybe a quick show of hands. We don't have a slider for this. Quick show of hands. Who has kind of evolved hybrid to think about when people work? So not just where, but when they work. What time of day, what days of the week? Hands up here who's kind of evolved that. We've got a few hands. It's brilliant to see. So I love that. It's kind of, I've seen this framed as an x-axis being where people work, a y-axis being when. But then I read about a z-axis. It's a 3D graph here. Bear with me, right? Which is what people work on.
Yeah.
And that the true evolution is perhaps at least looking at those three axes. So how does that work? What are the challenges for organizations around thinking about the three axes? And do you think organizations are there yet?
No, they're not there yet, but we're working towards it. I mean, I think when you look at the evolution of work, the way that we worked up until the pandemic forced us out of it was essentially, held over from industrial era constructs of work. Work happened for the most part 9 to 5. But we're talking about a segment of the workforce, right? Some, people who had to work on site, hourly employees, a different set of rules. But for people that were quote unquote knowledge workers, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, happened in an office. And all of those things have been kind of blown up now. And so when we're thinking about designing work, the where, how, and when doesn't necessarily matter. The what matters. The output matters. And I think from a historical perspective, many legacy kind of oriented people looked at productivity with the butts and seats model, right? I don't see you in an office, so how do I know you're productive? How do I know you're actually getting work done? And I'd push back on that and say, how do you even know that if you see them sitting at a desk? But I think what underpins the ability to make this effective transition is us collectively getting better at measuring output and work. And so if you are meeting deliverables and whether you're using OKRs or different platforms to measure that, it doesn't really matter when you're working to an extent. It certainly doesn't matter where you're working. It matters what you're producing. And we have to make a collective shift in HR and talent to be much more effective at measuring output for that to work.
So when you look at the challenge for a CPO, CHRO, HR leaders in general, there isn't, I imagine, a one-size-fits-all. I think we all probably agree with that. You speak with a lot of CPOs and CHROs. You interview from the podcast. You work with them on your accelerator program. What are the good ones doing, the best ones, in terms of how they approach the challenge of, well, what's going to be good for our workforce? And then secondly, how do they prepare the workforce for that change or evolution? So the two parts there. One is, how should the best practice, can a CPO think about her workforce and make that decision? What criteria perhaps should she look at? How should she come to that decision?
Yeah.
And then how do you communicate that with the workforce?
Yeah, I mean, it's a couple things. We think we've gotten a lot better at listening, all right? Really understanding, the idea of being able to gauge our employees on an annual basis in a survey, what they need and want, is out the window. So if you're doing that, stop. You've got to really increase the cadence of how you're getting that feedback from employees. And then you need to really understand that the plans that you build are not going to be concrete plans. And I think that's a big fundamental shift from HR, where historically we've tended to work off of playbooks and set ways of how we did certain things, right? Whether it's performance, succession planning, compensation. Now we have to think about that differently, and it has to be much more fluid. And so I think what you're seeing now is a shift towards more agile constructs. And when you're building plans, you're trying to build them in maybe 3 to 6 month increments, because you know that the world in 6 months could very well be different than the world you're designing for now. And so doing a really good job of listening, making sure that you're communicating with employees proactively so they understand what you're doing, and then leave room to adjust and adapt based on the circumstances as they roll out. We all talk about flexibility is the kind of underpinning of this new world of work. But what does that mean? How does that show up? And what you have to realize as a CPO is every environment is going to be different. Every culture is going to be different and for a variety of reasons. So you've really got to make sure that you're adapting it based on your circumstances, not necessarily an article you read or a white paper your CEO sent you. You have to really kind of tailor how you're designing for your people.
Yesterday we had a session with a smaller group of us, CPOs and CHROs, and you spoke and you quoted somebody as saying, I thought it was a lovely quote, the role of the chief people officer 2 years ago became the chief pandemic officer for a time at the beginning of 2020. And as you expanded on that, I think what you hinted towards was actually the role of CPO has become chief uncertainty officer.
Yeah.
In fact, the modern CPO, right, if you're trying to distinguish, well, why are they calling this HRD role a CPO? I think there is actually a fundamental difference. There's a mind shift in what that person thinks their role is. And that uncertainty is the new normal.
Yeah.
And you have to think about that. Is that what you mean around that kind of 3 to 6 month planning rather than solely being locked into long-term planning?
Yeah, because you've got to realize the plans that you're making decisions in real time based on the facts as they are at that moment in time, and those facts are changing. I mean, look back to 2020, vaccines roll out. Right, by early 2021, there's fairly widespread availability for vaccines. Everybody was like, great, we're doing our return to workplace plans in the summer. Everybody get on board, and then Delta hits. And everybody had to backtrack and say, oh, okay, you know what, we're actually not ready, it's a different environment, we're gonna push this back to a TBD time in the future. And then for everybody, they're like, well, September's the time, right? Schools will be open, people will be able to, they won't have the kids at home anymore. And then, we start preparing for that, and then Omicron, gets ready to come. And so these dates, we're making decisions based on the best information we have at the time, but the fact is things around us externally are impacting that. And so you really can't plan that far out. And it's hard because humans want certainty, right? Human nature, we want certainty. We want to be able to know what's going to happen. Employees have to make plans. They have to make, child care and coordination plans, family care, whatever it might be. And that's hard to do without uncertainty. And so I think it's more frustrating for them when companies make a firm commitment, they make all the preparations they need to make to meet that commitment, and then that commitment changes based on a new situation, a new variant, whatever it might be.
With uncertainty, we often look to see what others are doing. And I know, Lars, you've probably in the last 2 years interviewed maybe 100 CPOs, CHROs. Through your work, you're one of the founders of the HR open source movement. You've been a big believer in sharing.
Yeah.
Can you share with us maybe what you see as some of the great examples that different companies or leaders have executed on the last couple of years around hybrid work, around flexibility, that maybe you could share with us here?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, one of the most significant, transformational moments for HR was the very beginning of the pandemic. It was in March, and we knew this thing was coming. We didn't quite know what was going to happen, how it was going to impact our workforce, and then it was very clear that this was a global event, and everything was happening. And nobody working in HR had experienced anything like this before. And so, at that time, Coinbase kind of open sourced their pandemic response book. And then, that began to spread. And then other people kind of amplified that and created more open source programs so that for CHROs who are in that seat, that was a pretty terrifying moment in time for all of us, but especially for you that have the health and safety of your employees and potentially their lives in your hands as you're making these decisions. The ability and the way the community came together to open their practices, open their playbooks, share what they were doing, share where they were getting their information from, allowed us all to not go through that in isolation and make better decisions because they were calibrated against what our peers were doing. So I think that was probably the most transformative moment for HR. I think in terms of interesting stories, early in the pandemic, hospitality obviously was devastated. And Marriott, their business was very devastated. On the other side, companies, drugstores, their businesses were booming, like CVS. And there was a really interesting partnership between Marriott and CVS, where rather than having to lay off employees, Marriott did a kind of talent lend with CVS, where they created opportunities for thousands of Marriott employees to go over on a temporary basis to work for CVS who needed that talent. So I had never seen an exchange of talent quite like that, but it was fascinating just to see how the circumstances required people to think very differently. And again, we have this idea of the war for talent beat into our head relentlessly, but there were interesting cases of collaboration like that where they came together and said, let's do what's best for our employees, and they both benefited from it.
I remember hearing about a year into the pandemic, a similar story here in Europe, where I think one of the major European airlines worked with Amazon for a similar talent exchange.
Yeah.
And as well as being able to keep the workforce, because there was an element of redundancies cost a lot of money in Europe, right, to lay folks off. And most people believed it was going to be temporary, but didn't know how long it was going to be for. And you'd Amazon, again, most delivery businesses were ramping up and needing more staff. And it just made more sense, both in terms of dealing with the unions, the cost of laying off staff, to lend them out, bring them back in. But the upside of that, the unexpected upside, was that folks learned a whole new set of skills because they worked for a different organization, learned their processes, and then came back into their organization. Like, do you see any of those types of things sticking? Like, what happened in the pandemic, but it's only for the pandemic and that's it, we'll never see it again? And what do you think is going to be lasting around those kind of cooperations?
Yeah, look, I'd love to give you a punchy, firm idea, but the truth is I have no idea. Like, we're kind of in, maybe the second inning, if you want to allow me to throw in a baseball analogy, of this whole process. We don't really know how this is going to evolve. I think when you look at our practices around the shift towards hybrid, around the shift towards flexible work, around how we're having different conversations around things like mental health, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and belonging, we frame a lot of this in the context of the pandemic, but there's a lot more than just the pandemic happening. There's different conversations happening around social justice and racial equity. Russia is dropping bombs on Ukraine at this very moment. We've had, we're still in the aftermath of Brexit. There are, nationalist trends happening in different countries around the world. So, yes, the pandemic underpins so much of this, but so many other things are actually happening at the same time that we have to account for that are also increasing the volatility. So I don't really think there are, how many of you have CEOs that are pressuring you to return to work as it was in March of 2020?
You can put your hand up. We won't tell her what you said.
Yes, this is a safe environment. Nobody video, okay. Well, that's actually refreshing. I don't see a lot of hands up. That's good. They're out there, and the reality is the world of work from March of 2020 no longer exists. Period. So how we adapt, what we change, what we hold on to, what new practices we haven't even created yet we will be creating, that story is still to be written. So it's, for me, it's one of the reasons this is such an exciting time in our field, because we're literally rewriting the rules to work itself as we go, and we're doing that together. So. You
mentioned the war for talent, and we've heard the Great Resignation, the Great Reshuffle, all those things. Basically, code for it's bloody hard to hire talent right now, right? I think everyone agrees that the motivations of employees have fundamentally changed and changed extremely quickly. And I look back at March 2020 for this part of the world, and there was this collective moment when I think we all kind of sat back and said, we could die, our family could die, we didn't have a clue what was going to happen. There was an intense number of weeks where it was just really uncertain. I think when you go through a collective trauma on a global basis like that, and you come through it, which hopefully most of you have, you reframe lots of things. You reassess your life, you reassess your employment, and you perhaps change your values around what's important. Talk to me about what's changed from that employer value prop. And you mentioned, obviously, Ukrainian war and stuff like that, things that maybe wouldn't have been the purview of an employer. They wouldn't have, put out a statement, wouldn't have necessarily had to have a policy on things. That's changed. How has it changed from what you see?
Yeah, look, I think that, obviously we're in an employee-driven market right now, right? Anybody who's hiring, if you think hiring is easy, you're not being honest. And I don't see that changing, right? Unless there's some, large kind of global event that just disrupts the economy broadly. This is our reality for a while now. And so I think what we have to understand is the people who are trying to hire, we've all gone through a humanity-shaping event, and we've all gone through that differently, right? Some of us got COVID, recovered from COVID, maybe have long COVID. Some of us, it wasn't long ago that, especially in tech, we were glorifying hustle culture and grind and busyness. We wore busy like a badge of honor. We've swung very much in the other way. I think people really, and the opportunity in isolation to spend more time with our families, with those who we care about, has recalibrated what's important to us and what we want. And so I think that you'll start to see more, and this is partly because of that, partly maybe because of generational shifts, the idea of purpose-driven work is becoming more and more important. And so I think we have to understand that the candidates we're trying to hire are in the driver's seat in this. So whether it's hybrid work, whether it's workplace flexibility, whether it's experimenting with 4-day work weeks, right? Things like that. We have to get creative and innovative at what we can do to draw talent, particularly in this environment where everybody's hybrid. So, or not everybody, most people are hybrid. You have the ability to close your laptop one day and open your laptop the next day working for a different company. And so we have to rethink recruiting, and we really have to rethink both pre-boarding and onboarding, because again, the people we're hiring, we're doing it through screens, and if we're not really investing in that, we're going to be creating loose hires. It'll be very easy for other companies to take them out and bring them to their company.
And those moments of transition are really important. They can be immensely positive, and they can really kind of bring someone into your culture and organization if done well. But they're also quite a fragile time when we change jobs, when we get married, when we buy a new house. Any of those big moments are quite fragile. And I think in the past, and to quote one of the speakers we heard yesterday as well, we focused on onboarding from the perspective of the head. What are the practical things you need to know about how to do your job, how to onboard in our company? And we didn't put the same effort into the heart. Mm-hmm. How can I make you understand our business, fall in love with our mission, our purpose, what we do, get to know your colleagues? And I think that was one of the big things that we saw in the pandemic, was that we had to focus on that, because this was a person sitting on a desk X miles away from you that you're probably not going to meet for many months or even years. Yeah. And they're not going to have the traditional way of kind of getting into our culture, which is by osmosis, by being in an office or a premises. But I want to talk about one of the other elements you mentioned, which is around, and related to this, I think. You talked about D&I, mm-hmm. and most people in the room, I'm sure, have really hopefully upped their game on their D&I agenda and their practices in the last couple of years, particularly after summer 2020. So we had the pandemic, we had the murder of George Floyd, which led a global movement in a very positive way in terms of highlighting diversity and inclusion in organizations. One of the elements that gets left behind sometimes is the piece around equity. Mm-hmm. And folks kind of go, oh yeah, you got to put DE and I now. It's great. It's another letter, fantastic. And they still focus on the D and the I bit. But arguably, the equity piece is more important. It's more fundamental across everything. I know we've talked about this before, but I wonder, could you share your views around what equity looks like and its role in the broader context of the people journey, and how organizations are being successful about driving more equitable workforces and work environments?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. I think as a field, we've really gone through and thought about how we've evolved, even in the language that we use, right? From diversity, and oftentimes diversity was looked at through the lens purely of hiring, to diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, access. The way we think about it and talk about it has expanded and broadened. I think when you look at equity specifically, really that is being very intentional about disrupting systems of inequity in your workplace. And statistically, the field of HR is almost 70% white, statistically, and so these systems of inequity are designed, by design, to create disproportionate outcomes that adversely impact our underrepresented employees. And if we're not mindful, if we're not doing the work, as you say, to understand what those systems are so that we can disrupt them, whether it's pay equity, promotion equity, there's a range of ways to look at it, they're designed to self-perpetuate. They will continue to happen unless we can break those cycles and those systems. And to do that, it requires a lot of individual attention from practitioners. And so I think particularly in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, you started to see a bit of a collective shift, not just in the language and the conversation, but I think, and hopefully the commitment to learning more about these spaces, particularly for white practitioners, so that they can make more of a difference, so that they can identify some of these systems that are in place that if they don't have that knowledge, they will remain invisible and they will continue to produce disproportionate outcomes. So I think that's where the equity piece comes in. It's really understanding and disrupting those systems so that you can identify ways so that all employees have equal access to opportunity, to career development, to growth, and more.
You were sharing with me on that point a story of a company you came across where they even just redefined an employee, because often in our workforces we have a mixture of contractors, direct FTEs, and a whole bunch of folks. But from an equity point of view, they're just people are people, and we work together. Yeah. Share with me what you learned around one particular company's example of how they tried to make it more equitable.
Well, yes, I mean, so SurveyMonkey, they've rebranded now, but at that time they were SurveyMonkey, and they would run quarterly. They moved from an annual review process to a quarterly kind of survey and review process. And when they did that, one of the questions they asked, they found that, and this was pre-pandemic, so back when they were in offices, they found that the number one thing their employees wanted and asked questions about was, do the people who work in their building, so they had a cafeteria, they had custodial staff, do they have the same benefits as SurveyMonkey employees? And that answer was no. They subcontracted that out. They weren't SurveyMonkey employees. So they decided, because the feedback from the employees was that they viewed them, they wanted them to have equitable access to the same things that they did as employees. So they made a significant investment to actually buy the same level of benefits, vacation, everything for that contingent workforce that weren't actually SurveyMonkey employees, but because their employees came out and said, we want them to have access to the same things that we do, they made the decision to make that investment. So it was fascinating, I think, sometimes, especially if you're not asking your employees to really understand what it is they need and want and think and believe, you would miss that. But this is a case where they asked, they weren't expecting that answer, but they knew it was important to their employees, and they made the investment. And Momentive is what their new name is. They changed their name last year to Momentive. So
what are your top tips for our audience here today, HR and people leaders? As we're embracing this new world, not going backwards to 2020, what are the top tips you have in terms of the skills that HR leadership need to really embrace and get comfortable with over the next few years?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we talked about the instability of the environment we're in. That's not going anywhere. So to me, one of the biggest things that you need, frankly, in any role in HR, but certainly as a leader, is learning agility. You've got to make space to learn and keep tabs on trends and news and events that are happening around you. And I get it, your job is hard. You don't have free time. That's not a luxury that you have. So it's easy for you to get caught up in the natural inertia of your job. And maybe it was a great interview that Johnny had that you want to go back and read. Maybe it was a white paper. Maybe it was a podcast, whatever it might be. And you're like, oh, all my friends are recommending this. I should read this. And then I got pulled into this, I got pulled into that, and it doesn't happen. And what I recommend, at a bare minimum for everybody in this room, 1 hour per week, put that in your calendar, block it, defend it, do not let anyone schedule over that. That's your learning time. And that's your time where you can catch up with all these articles, because so much is going on. And as a leader, you've got to be able to distill that external information to advise your C-suite peers, to advise your team and your strategy. So that's a big piece. And the second one is network equity, right? These days, nobody in this room possesses all the information that you need to do your job in your head, right? You just don't. There's too much to know. There's too much to understand. But if you have the right network in place, if you're conscious about investing in your own network equity, and you're all here, so I expect this is important to you, you may not have that information, but it doesn't matter. You know the people who do, who you can call and say, hey, you know what? We're going through an M&A deal, and this thing came up, and I've never seen this before. I know you did this. How'd you figure that out? And then have the ability to actually get that information. So those would be two things that are true now, will certainly be true tomorrow and in the indefinite future.
We're out of time, but one last thing. Maybe could you share with us a little bit about your accelerator program, why it was created, and how folks can find out more about it?
I wrote Redefining HR last year, and as I was getting feedback from readers, people were, the whole idea of the book is I wanted to kind of document more or less a blueprint for what modern HR can look like. And so I got a lot of feedback from people saying they were inspired by the book and where can they go to continue their education. And I didn't have a good answer for that, so I set out to build that. And so really, I think especially for chief people officers, most of the accelerator is aimed towards people and talent leaders who are either newly in a CPO role or aspiring to be that. We don't get the training and support in a lot of the non-functional areas that we need, from board influence, IPO readiness, crisis communications, things like that. And so that was the aim in creating the accelerator, is creating both community and training resources to help leaders build those capabilities.
Lars, thanks so much for joining us. And for all of you, thanks for listening and taking the time out to hopefully expand your network today. Enjoy the afternoon.
All right. Thanks, Johnny. Thanks, everyone.